Born in the wake of World War II, the RAND Corporation quickly became the creator of America's anti-Soviet nuclear strategy, a magnet for the best and the brightest. Its ranks included Cold War luminaries such as Albert Wohlstetter, Bernard Brodie, and Herman Kahn, who arguably saved us from nuclear annihilation and unquestionably created Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. In the Kennedy era, RAND analysts and their theories of rational warfare steered our conduct in Vietnam. Those same theories drove our invasion of Iraq 45 years later, championed by RAND-affiliated actors such as Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, and Zalmay Khalilzad. RAND's most significant contribution might be the least known, rational choice theory, a model explaining all human behavior through self-interest. With that theory, RAND sparked the Reagan-led transformation of our social and economic system, but also unleashed a resurgence of precisely the forces whose existence it denied: religion, patriotism, tribalism. It also set off the wave of deregulation that almost destroyed the world's financial markets. That is from the back cover of Alex Abella's Soldiers of Reason, the RAND Corporation, and the Rise of the American Empire. It is my pleasure to have Alex on tonight as a guest. Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you?
Very well, very well. Alex, great, this book,
yes.
The RAND Corporation.
Right.
Tell us about it. Why'd you write about it? And
well, the RAND Corporation. It's still in Santa Monica, I first heard of it when I was back at Columbia at university back in New York, and it was touted as this place where they did all kinds of secret stuff against the war in Vietnam, sort of like the mad scientist kind of image of the place. And so I didn't think about it. I mean, I was a kid at the time. And later on, I wrote a lot of books, novels, screenplays, and I wrote a book also about Hitler's secret terrorist plot against the United States called Shadow Warriors. And the one time when I was signing books here in L.A., a friend of mine showed up, and he was from RAND, and all of a sudden that confluence of terrorism and RAND sort of like sparked the thought in my mind, like, what do we know about RAND? Who has ever written about that? And so I got in touch with RAND, and much to my surprise, they decided to go along with me writing a book about them. And they were very, very cooperative, very courteous. They opened up their files. They put me in touch with people, and gave me all kinds of information. I was really surprised. They just said that I could not use any national security stuff, which is fine, classified stuff, which is fine. I didn't want to do that. Because, on the other hand, I thought for a moment, well, this is really not going to work out because, after all, what we want to know are the secrets. But much to my surprise, what I discovered is that the influence of RAND is so pervasive that, as I say in the book, we're really the bastard children of RAND. We don't even know it. It's so incredible, all the many things that they have done over the years.
Now, this name RAND, comes from research and development?
Right. Now, originally, RAND, was supposed to be, just in the business of developing weapons for the Air Force. They were supposed to be sort of like a prototype Manhattan Project. As you recall, the Manhattan Project is when you had civilian scientists working for the armed forces to develop the atom bomb. After the war, the top people at the Air Force realized that all that brain power that they had harnessed during World War II was going to go back to their civilian jobs, because scientists and the military don't really go well together. So what they decided to do was to set up some kind of independent bureau or independent organization that would actually study the best way to make bigger and better weapons for the Air Force. But after a few years, it didn't stop just there. It started expanding into social studies and into social research and into all kinds of theoretical research, including a much broader view of national security. And that became the RAND that we know today.
So they started getting into out of simply designing weapon systems or strategy, get into perhaps mobilizing or manipulating society in the interest of so-called national security.
Well, absolutely. They became like the top advisors to the federal government on the question of national security. It's funny because the first thing that they came up with was a spaceship project. They were the first ones to actually take the notion of having a satellite spaceship going around the Earth and took it out of the world of comic books and science fiction and actually said this can be done with today's technology, that even with the technology that they had back then. However, the Air Force was not interested in that. The Air Force was actually interested in bigger and better bombs, which they then proceeded to do. But along the way, they also proceeded to come up with a theory of general warfare, which did not go over very well with the Air Force, and started getting into all kinds of different issues as well, and trying to offer their, so to speak, their brains to other branches of the armed forces, specifically the Army and the Navy. And they started getting into social research as well, because they figured, well, the only way to actually win this war, the Cold War at the time, was by actually trying to figure out what the Soviets were trying to do at the time. Now, you have to remember, this is a very complicated time. It's right now we look back on this, 60 years later and go, oh, yeah, well, the Soviet Union, they had the bomb, we had the bomb. It's a question of, who's going to be bigger, who's going to do what to whom. It was a really complicated world. For one thing, the United States really didn't have any good operatives within the Soviet Union. We had no idea what the Kremlin was up to. So as a result of that, RAND, which was advising the U.S. government, had to develop their own experts on the Kremlin and on the Soviet Union. And as a result of that, they came up with what I believe is the most lasting influence, which is rational choice theory.
Rational choice theory. That basically that's the idea of did that come out of like a poker game?
No, although it was somewhat related to it.
Okay.
One of the obviously, when you're talking about conflict, you're talking about different things. You're talking about how people are going to react in conflict, which is the best way to react as a military power if you're threatened, all kinds of things. As a result of that, they started developing game theory. And game theory, which we still have today, was to a very large degree a result of studies that were done in RAND for the military. That is, how are we going to react in case the Soviet Union decides to drop the bomb here or drop the bomb there, or they move the troops here, they move the troops there. All of that had to be taken into account. Nobody had ever done a systematic study of all this until RAND came along, and that's what game theory came about. But ultimately, game theory was put aside by RAND scientists because they realized that ultimately what really counts in game theory is the rationality behind that. That is, and the rationality itself is guided by emotional predilection. But as a result of their studies in game theory, they came up with rational choice theory. Now, rational choice theory also came about as a means of counteracting Marxism. Now, I don't know whether you listeners remember what Marxism is all about, since, it's been discredited in all but a handful of countries. I mean, in China, for instance, they call themselves Marxists and communists, but actually it's just state-run capitalism. And in Vietnam, it's the same thing. And even in Cuba, which was the last redoubt of that, they're moving towards having some kind of state capitalism. That is, in which you have the government, which operates a kind of a capitalist system. But back at the time, back in the 1950s, I mean, a lot of people thought that Western-style capitalism, our democracy itself, was at risk, that the future belonged to the commies, to the Soviet Union. And we had to come up with a system whereby we'd be able to say, no, there is justice in what we do. There is an ethical view of looking at the world. There is a rational view of looking at the world, which the communists do not do. And that's how they came about with rational choice theory. Basically, rational choice theory says that humans are rational actors and that they will decide what is in their best interest. That's the basic explanation of it. But unfortunately, what that does is that when you take it to its nth degree, it sort of like does away with things like patriotism, altruism, and religion, because none of those can be explained by a rational actor. I mean, after all, what is rational about a patriotic American wanting to go out and fight in the war? Because after all, if he's really rational, he would let somebody else fight, right? He can stay at home and enjoy the benefits of having somebody else fight for him. That's the rational choice. And also that eliminates patriotism. It eliminates religion, because after all, if you believe that people are ultimately rational in their actions, then how can you explain an allegiance to the Ten Commandments, or an allegiance to any kind of thing that does not advance your own interests, or any kind of religious precept? So therefore, you get rid of that. And of course, it gets rid of altruism. Why should you, which means charitable foundations and all that. Why should you give any money to a foundation? Because that's not going to help you. You fall into what the other Rand, which is Ayn Rand, who, even though she wasn't related or connected to Rand, espoused a kind of theory that is very similar to rational choice theory. But as a result of rational choice theory, we have all kinds of corollaries that come out of that. I mean, one of them, for instance, is deregulation, because after all, you have to have actors who are actually seeking their own benefit. So therefore, you shouldn't have any kind of rules, because people are rational, and therefore they will do what is in their best interest. And what's in their best interest is what's in the best interest of society at large. Basically, what rational choice theory did, and this all came out of Rand, is that it turned people from, instead of being patriots, they turn into consumers, into consumer choices, into, what are the best choices for consumers, instead of making us people who have citizens with duties and obligations. It turned us into consumers with choices in the market. It turned everything into a marketplace. The whole world becomes a marketplace. And for instance, that's how come they can say, well, we're going to impose, we're going to tax your street. Not only, because we have to make sure that people are rational in their use of these things. So it's no longer a question that you have a right to things as a citizen. You're being taxed, and you're being controlled, and you're being subjected to all these different regulations, because you're supposed to be a rational actor. So you no longer have obligations and rights. You have choices. You're acting as a consumer. So that's basically the thing that we have, the consequences that we are living under as a result of rational choice theory, which came out of Rand.
Did they coordinate, or did this have any relation to maybe the works of like Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, decades before?
No, actually, this came out, believe it or not, of mathematical constructs. I know it's really, you start reading these things and you feel like you've gone down the rabbit hole with Alice. It's like, what the heck is going on here? Or like that famous dilemma by that Greek philosopher, which says that the rabbit can never catch up to the tortoise, because every time that the rabbit takes moves, then the tortoise moves as well. So therefore, they can never catch up, which is actually insane. But it's false predicates. But no, it came out of mathematical constructs as to how to come up with a theory that would actually explain Western style consumerism and Western style government.
So it's an over-reliance on maybe on the scientific or rational approach to studying
Absolutely.
society.
Yes. And let me give you an example. It continued into Vietnam as you may or may not know, if you read the book, you'll find out that a lot of people from Rand went to the federal government, to the Department of Defense, and during the beginning of the Vietnam War. And of course, there, again, they applied rational choice theory. And the theory was that if they applied enough pressure on Hanoi, Hanoi would see that it's going to be too painful to keep on resisting the United States. And that eventually it would say, okay, let's bargain, right? But when you're faced with an enemy that doesn't believe in that, that's ready to sacrifice himself or herself for the sake of a greater ideal, not just his own personal interest, you can't fight that with rational choice theory. And as we know, that's what happened in Vietnam. They kept on taking losses, and they didn't care. They kept going, and they kept going because the whole country was dedicated to the idea that they were going to throw out the United States, that they were going to be totally independent, and they were going to throw us out. And that's what happened. So that's why Vietnam, to a very large degree, was a total failure. Because the United States would not go overboard. We wouldn't bomb Hanoi, we wouldn't bomb the dams, which would have killed millions of people, but we were just inflicting pain, more and more pain. But ultimately, the pain did no good because these people were not rational. When you have a rational actor meeting an irrational actor, the irrational will always win because he doesn't care. He's not playing by your rules.
Mm-hmm. And it's only irrational because what's not factoring in the equation is the human element here.
Exactly, and they did never factor the human element. And again, I mean, even now, going as far as Iraq, our invasion of Iraq, and that whole question, of the revisions of army theory, of going in and imposing this new government, we never accounted for the fact that there were religious divisions because religion is not something that's contemplated within people who are following rational choice theory, or have that kind of approach to reality, which is what Rumsfeld had. Rumsfeld, when he was the Secretary of Defense, and obviously Paul Wolfowitz, who was his underling, they had a certain approach to reality, to the war, which is let's go in, let's go as fast as we can, conquer as much as we can, and then we'll just kind of sit around and, let the chips fall where they may. Because we don't have to worry about these things because they will see that now it's in their rational interest to act this way. Instead, they went back to their old irrational religious divisions and people trying, to outmaneuver each other because of certain religious concepts that they had. So, it doesn't work. But again, of course, we're all living as a result of that under that theory.
And of course, we're putting irrational in quotation marks.
Of course, because I think it's irrational to be rational. Yeah. Because humans are not totally rational actors, and that's something that's been learned, or actually that finally, people in academia finally realize that's the way the world really is.
Well, that's like the idea that whole idea of don't be irrational as if it's a pejorative term, right?
Right, exactly. Exactly. Yep.
And of course, you have to mention both Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz were alumnus from RAND, correct?
Well, Paul Wolfowitz was indirectly an alumnus of RAND. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld went from being on the RAND board to being a Secretary of Defense. Mm-hmm. Paul Wolfowitz was taught by the man who is probably the most influential person to go through RAND, even though his name is not widely known. His name was Albert Wohlstetter, a mathematician. Yeah. Gee, what a surprise. A mathematician. Yeah, I know. What a surprise, right? Who viewed the world through mathematics. But on the other hand, they did do, in my opinion, and so I'm trying to show in the book, they did prevent what could have been a total disaster for the United States. There's something called the basing study. The basing study is as to how nuclear weapons were going to be based in case of an attack by the Soviet Union.
And this was done. Did this create the nuclear triad?
Yes, well, the nuclear triad it was developed out of RAND as well, which is the fact that it's the three legs of the stool when it comes to nuclear strategy. But RAND did come up with the major concept of nuclear strategy, which is not mutual assured destruction. That's something that they did not agree with. What they came up with was counterforce, which is if somebody attacked the United States, in this case the Soviet Union attacked the United States with nuclear weapons, then we had enough capability left over that we would inflict such damage on them that, again, any rational person in any rational government would see that it would make no sense to attack us because we still have so much left over that therefore, they wouldn't do it. Now that devolved, and I say devolved specifically, not evolved, devolved into mutual assured destruction because by that time, under McNamara, we had so many missiles, and Soviet Union had so many missiles that it made no sense at all to keep on adding missiles to our strategic nuclear force because we would destroy the entire world many times over. But that's why it was mutual assured destruction, and that's why he was mad. And RAND scientists were always opposed to that, saying that is a total waste of money. But sometimes things, they take on a life of their own, and that's what happened with a lot of the concepts that came out of RAND.
Mm-hmm. Chris, with RAND came this idea of sort of the Cold War guru, the defense intellectual, and a lot of you mentioned these luminaries, and maybe by mentioning some of these luminaries, you can get a better understanding of it, like Wohlstetter, Herman Kahn, Paul Nitze, and some of these guys. Paul
Nitze, right? Exactly, Paul Nitze. All these people, who shaped the foreign policy of the United States, their nuclear policy, their strategic policy. But like I said, whose theories also changed the way in which we view government and how we view each other, whether we're actually citizens with duties or whether we actually are consumers with choices of products.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fundamental thing, which I really want people to realize, that this is what came out of RAND. On the other hand, during the 1950s, they did, like I said, the basing study is a study that was done by Albert Wohlstetter. At the time, we did not have long-range missiles. So in order to deliver a nuclear warhead, that is, in order to attack with a nuclear weapon, we had to do it with bombers. What Wohlstetter realized is that the way that we had sighted our bombers, that the Soviet Union could come in and with a sneak attack, very much like what happened in Hiroshima, they would have been able to wipe out our nuclear capability. And at that point, they would have called the shots. In a way, it almost reminds me, I don't know if your viewers have watched this incredible series that's on Amazon called The Man in the High Castle, which posits that the Nazis were able to come up with the atomic bomb before we did, and they dropped it on us. And once they did that, then we had to surrender. And once we surrendered, then the United States was occupied. The east is occupied by the Nazis, the west by the Japanese, and there's a very small nuclear zone in the middle of the country. So in any case, going back to reality, what Wohlstetter saw is that our underbelly was exposed to a sneak Soviet attack, and he was able to change that so that would not occur. As a result of that, RAND gained incredible influence within the federal government. And when Kennedy was elected, a lot of people went straight from RAND into the Department of Defense. By the way, I should add here as well that when President Eisenhower, in his valedictorian address, his speech, in which he warns of the military-industrial complex, he was specifically referring to RAND, specifically referring to the way in which people were using RAND studies to be able to augment the federal budget to be used on defense, on weaponry, specifically on nuclear defense. And he was completely against that. Matter of fact, he was one of the first people, President Eisenhower, to start trying to, achieve nuclear disarmament. So there's a lot of things that came out of RAND at that time, and they became extremely influential. But once again, it's the worm in the apple. It's the fact that they thought that everything was rational that ultimately caused a lot the debacle that turned out to be Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Now, with Herman Kahn, you mentioned him. He came up with the idea
Yeah.
of a winnable nuclear war.
Exactly. Yes. Again, being rational.
Yeah.
I mean, when going back to President Eisenhower, and President Eisenhower was told, "Oh, we could do this," I mean, he said there wouldn't be enough bulldozers to bury the dead. Why would anybody want to do this? Why would anybody want to have so many nuclear weapons? He refused to increase the Defense Department budget. And that's why some of the Rand people then gave information to Senator John F. Kennedy, alerting him to something that they believed was a missile gap, that the Soviet Union had many more missiles than we did, and therefore we, were at risk of being annihilated by the Soviet Union because they had this nuclear superiority. And that was one of the arguments that Kennedy used against Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, of course, knowing that there was no such thing, but he couldn't talk about it because it was top secret. So again, it's just like this whole manipulation of facts and information, and all within it, all containing within it that kernel of rationality, which is, like I said, the worm in that apple, which is refusing to accept that humans ultimately are not really rational, that we use rationality as a weapon to achieve irrational desires.
There was a comment made by General Thomas Powers, the Strategic Air Command commander, who reflected Herman Kahn's view, I guess. He said, "Look, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win."
I know, which is absurd, but yet this is what these people thought. And, of course, that was sort of like, let me put it this way. What Herman Kahn wrote in his books and what gave him all that fame and fortune, and he was able to go ahead and found the Hudson Institute, that was like the credo of the Rand people. Matter of fact, they thought that his book on thermonuclear war was a ripoff of all the ideas that they have been bandying about for the last 4 or 5 years. And when Albert Wohlstetter received an advance copy, actually not advance copy, received the manuscript of Herman Kahn's book because he had to submit it to Rand before publication. Albert Wohlstetter's Kahn asked him, "What should I do with it?" He said, Throw it in the fire. This is garbage. We both discussed all this. This is all news. What are you talking about? But once all those ideas came out and the public heard about this, everybody was appalled. I mean, like the division of people into how much food each particular group was going to get. That, it's like the old people, which is anybody over 50, they would be allowed to eat contaminated food because, after all, they were not productive. Children could be put to use in manufacturing, sensitive weapons. And people would be classified according to how much contamination they'd had already experienced and what their degree of knowledge was and how much it could contribute to society. This is insane. I mean, this is like worse than any Nazi fantasy because the whole world has been destroyed.
This is like that conversation in Dr. Strangelove.
Yes, exactly. And Dr. Strangelove, matter of fact, was a total ripoff of all the ideas that, again, have been discussed quite seriously in Rand. And when when the idea for the movie was proposed, originally that was going to be a serious movie dealing with all these issues, sort of like some of the other movies that came out at the time in the early '60s.
Yeah, Failsafe. Remember Failsafe?
Like Failsafe, exactly. But on the other hand, the director decided, no, nobody can take this seriously. Let's make a farce out of this, which is exactly what it should be, because nobody could or should take these ideas seriously. Because that's what happens when you become hyper-rational.
Yeah, I like it when the Dr. Strangelove is proposing his mineshaft plan to the generals, and he goes, of course, space would be spared for, military and political leadership, of course. Of course, you'd have to have 10 women to every 1 man, and the women have to
that's right, exactly.
Yeah, and women have to be exceedingly attractive to encourage procreation. The Soviet.
You won't be.
The Soviet
right.
goes, I find your plan rather interesting, Dr. Strangelove.
Like I said, that's just a follow-up to what was in this book. I mean, when Herman Kahn went around and started giving his lectures, so Paul, some people actually throwing up, after they heard his lecture. I mean, it happened more than once. There was practically rioting because they couldn't believe that something like this was actually being contemplated. But like I said, that's what happened. And these are, as a result of all these things, this is what happens,
And there's you have a thing about, I'm reading that Daniel Ellsberg was involved in all this strategizing, and he became.
I was about to do that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. Go talk about Daniel Ellsberg. Go ahead.
That's right. I was about to talk about Daniel Ellsberg because, again, some of these people ultimately realize, this is insane. I guess sometimes, it's like Paul on the road to Damascus. You have to hear the voice, see the light, and you fall off, and ultimately get to Damascus, and the scales fall from your eyes. And that's what happened to Daniel Ellsberg when he went to Vietnam after he had been, touting all these rational choice theories as applied to Vietnam. And by the way, Rand actually did do a study on the Viet Cong, etc. And to their credit, I must say that they recognized that the Viet Cong were not rational actors, and that the VC would never pay attention to any kind of rational theory because they were patriots and they would fight to the death, each and every one of them. But they thought that Hanoi would be rational, but not the VC. In any case, when Ellsberg comes back, and he is, the McNamara, Secretary of Defense McNamara, has commissioned the Rand Corporation to do a study on the origins of Vietnam War, how we all get in there. And it was a top secret study. Only 3 copies were supposed to be made. And he starts reading this, and all of a sudden, like I said, the scales fell from his eyes because he realized, oh my God, you know what? The government has been lying to us all these years. Really? It's like, how naive can you be? But I guess there were different times. I don't know. I mean, to me, it's just like, because I guess I'm too cynical. And so then he realized, oh my God, I have to bring this out. And, he started, making copies of it, sending it out to legislators. No legislators, no senators really wanted to do anything about this. So ultimately he took it to the media. He took it to the New York Times and the Washington Post. And then he became one of the most wanted men in American history at the time. I mean, of all the time. I mean, but especially, the Nixon administration was going after him, gangbusters. They put him on trial for, betraying state secrets. But then, as always, again, Richard Nixon tipped his hand, and then he sent the plumbers into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to see what else they could find out. And when that came out during the trial, then the whole case was dismissed. So, he came out, smelling like a rose.
Yeah, all these guys who apparently were tied to the Kennedy assassination.
Yes.
Everything connects.
Everything connects. I mean, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but sometimes you wonder, really, guys?
Hunt and Sturgis.
That's right.
All those guys.
But they were not connected to Rand. I will say that to Rand's credit. But all those guys, absolutely.
In your book, you mentioned that Ellsberg emerged from Rand so pessimistic that he declined to involve himself in the Rand's pension plan.
Right. He didn't think there was a future for the world, and that's why he decided to go to Vietnam, and he said no, we have to change this. I mean, and that he did the best he could.
Now, we're talking about the Rand Corporation as a think tank connected to the military. It grew directly out of the military, the Air Force, in 1946, 47. And it came out of course, it is the best example of the military-industrial complex because it is sort of a outgrowth of both the Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force, and also Douglas Aircraft, correct?
Exactly, yes. Matter of fact, well, they have to put them somewhere. And Douglas Aircraft said, okay, they can put them in our plant. at the time, here in Southern California, and I'm talking to you from Los Angeles, at the time, the military was one of the top industries here in Southern California, and Douglas Aircraft had been extremely involved. Obviously, in the manufacture of all the airplanes during the war, and they had a very tight relationship with the Air Force, so they volunteered to do that. That didn't last because after a while, what happened is that the Douglas Aircraft was trying to get contracts from the government, but that people back in Washington thought there would be a conflict of interest if they gave contracts then to Douglas Aircraft, even though they had, a thing going on with the Air Force and, they had this think tank. So therefore, after a while, RAND was invited to go, and then RAND then became its own independent corporation in 1948.
Mm-hmm. But independent, but always being lavished with government, with the Department.
Oh yes, of course.
DoD
right.
contracts.
Yes, right, but the Department of Defense, right, but they divorced themselves from McDonnell Douglas, and from Douglas Aircraft actually, because it wasn't McDonnell Douglas yet. It was McDonnell and Douglas, from Douglas, and they became their own corporation. But yeah, like I said, doing contract work for the Air Force.
So it's not surprising that their studies or the results of their studies would always argue in favor of more military spending, correct?
Of course, they knew which side of the bread was buttered. Come on. They're rational, right?
So did they ever apply that to themselves? It makes them critical of their own objectivity, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the other thing you have to remember, you're probably too young to remember, and I was very, very young at the time, but rationality was very hip at the time. In the early 50s, early 60s. I mean, everybody thought that, all the woes of the world could be contained, could be solved by the use of applied rationality. And RAND itself touted itself as the rational solution to all the world's problems. They had ads in the Scientific American, with all the scientists striking heroic poses and saying, we can offer, the rational way of doing things. And, it was cool. It was like jazz in the late 50s, early 60s. It was like, yeah, man, we're hip, we're happening, we're rational. We know what's good. We know what's happening. And that lasted for a number of years, After all, I mean, even the Kennedy administration, had that whole rational, hip, we know what's best because, we are the intellectuals. And that's what happened. And like I said, Vietnam was the debacle. It's what proved them absolutely wrong, that showed the limits of rationality. But apparently, every 10 to 20 years, we go through the same thing. It's like we go through the same cycle. No, you can't be rational about these things. You have to take other factors into consideration.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the pictures in your book here, and you have one here of Albert Wohlstetter with his daughter and wife at his home in Beverly Hills. And the home itself is a typical modern 50s, very, very linear.
Right.
Yeah, very
linear,
cold.
Yes, I wonder why. Right, exactly.
It's very, very cold. Architecture, even the architecture of the RAND building itself, architecture tells a lot about the humans.
Yes, exactly, and the preferences, yes.
Yeah.
But of course, after Vietnam then became the disaster that everybody knew it was, from 1965 on, everybody knew there's no way we can win this war. But they kept on going because it was Johnson, and Johnson was insisting that, he wanted to nail that coonskin to the wall, and he wasn't going to be the first American president to lose a war in the 20th century. So they kept on going. So what RAND did is that it started veering away from from purely defense strategy and work, and started going into other kinds of studies. And they started going into urban studies, which is, the movement of history. I will say this about RAND. By the way, I may be critical of RAND, but in a way, I'm also affectionate. I mean, I feel like an odd affection toward them because I do think that they had their role to play, and they did good. But it's just that, you had to balance, it's like this crazy uncle that you have that, when he's sober, he's a great guy, but when he drinks, oh man, the things he does, Yeah. So in RAND's case, is they're drinking from the potion of rationality. When they start drinking that thing and they drink too much of it, forget about it. But, when they temper it, they can actually do some very interesting and very effective studies, as they did, for instance, in New York. As I said, they started doing urban studies. They started, trying to use their rational choice approach, the rational approach to problem solving. And by the way, they're still doing it. I mean, Rand's still around. I mean, that old building was torn down, and with the money that they made from that, they built themselves a really cool, beautiful, like a cool house kind of, building, curves and glass, and it's right there in Santa Monica, right by the beach. So again, it's very symptomatic, emblematic of what life is today, of our tastes. But they're still around. Still half of the work that they do is for the government.
Do they still have a sculpture of a nuclear explosion occurring as you enter the building?
No, they don't have.
Okay. Poor taste.
They don't want to be reminded of that, and that's part of it. And that's what I was saying before. It's like I feel this affection toward them. After studying them for so long, talking to so many people over there. I mean, they don't pretend like me.
No, yeah.
I don't know. I guess.
Some of the reforms, like rational choice theory, and some of the the so-called free market reforms of the Reagan era.
Right. Right.
Now, some of that, it's easy to criticize. Wasn't that also a reaction to the excesses of the '60s, the guns and butter policies, and the over bureaucratization of American society? We've had all the alphabet soup agencies, from the '30s to the '60s, and you had, of course, the economic debacle of the '70s, brought about by the spending of the '60s. Everyone blamed Carter, but really it was Johnson, Nixon, and
Right. I agree. No, I think in a way, the way that they applied rational choice theory, which is very interesting, and now that you bring it up, because they brought it up because the DoD, the Department of Defense, was being run according to parochial political interests. Mm-hmm. So therefore, whatever the senator that had a lot of political pull wanted, that's what they would do. They wanted to open a base over here, spend this much money, etc. It was all political. Yeah. So what the Rand people did once McNamara came in, and he brought all the people, is to apply rationality to it. And that I think was a very wise use of rational choice, which you have certain resources. What's the best way to use these resources, and what is it that you want to accomplish? There was another thing that they had come up with back in the 50s, which is called systems analysis. That came out of studies that they did read out during and after the war. That came out during the World War II. They applied it after the war, and which is what you study everything from the result backwards. That is, if you want to achieve this one particular result, right? What are the particular things that you need in order to get to that particular point? Instead of the way that the Army and the armed forces did everything at the time was saying, well, we have these elements, we have these supplies, we have all this material, we have all these things. This is what we can accomplish with that. So systems analysis turns that on its head and says, no. If we want to achieve this particular goal, what is it that we need in order to get there? Now, that may sound like, hey, we do that every day nowadays. But back then, nobody did that. It's really amazing. The way that Rand has changed the way that we look at systems, and we look at politics, and that we look at supply, at the supply chain. It's amazing. So that's what systems analysis did, and that's what the Rand people brought to the Pentagon. And that was superbly done. And by the way, that's what they're still doing right now. Only now they're applying it to, for instance, to medicine. They're applying it to, I don't know, even the study of marijuana. Even in politics. It's, why do some people vote this way? One of the latest studies that they just came up with is to thinking that the people who are voting for Donald Trump are acting rationally. and that people think that they acting according to the self-interest, and they think that somebody who can come in and to shake up the system and who has business experience, etc. Well, obviously, liberal Democrats think, oh, this guy's a misogynist and a racist, and he doesn't know what he's doing. And how could people actually vote for somebody like that who spouts things like that? But they say no. I mean, and this is part of the RAND study, which is no. I mean, these people actually are acting according to their own self-interest, and it's understandable. And that's only one study that they've done. They've done many, many things. But again, using systems analysis, I think it's good for analyzing, societal problems. Mm-hmm. Always bearing in mind, of course, that people ultimately are not rational.
Now, with think tanks, the role of the think tank with RAND, of course, their think tanks date back, I think, as early as the Brookings Institute. That was like 1916. And
right, exactly. They were the first think tank, exactly. Yeah, right.
Now,
Brookings was.
These are ostensibly created to create good government, but I'm a bit more cynical than that. Obviously, if you look at the role of the oligarchs, the Rockefellers, the Harriman, right. They endowed universities, they built universities, they funded education, that general education board, and their whole idea was the way to amass greater wealth and also gain total control of society is to control the culture, and you do that through creating think tanks. Through think tanks, you can influence government, not just through bribery, but also by, as you said, with Rand. Rand wouldn't answer the question. It would actually frame the question in a way to get the answer they want, and that's that's almost like a salesman, right?
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
So this gets into social engineering. It gets into manipulating education. It gets into advertising, which is a big part of consumerism. Even today, if you look at today's think tanks, they're all corporate funded. But and today it's harder and harder to separate corporate from government.
Unfortunately, you're correct about that.
On the
other hand, you have to ask yourself, hasn't it always been thus? Mm-hmm. I mean, didn't Sloan say what's good for GM, it's good for the country? I mean, wasn't Mellon the Secretary of the Treasury under during the 1920s? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not so simple. And all these, I mean, hey, look at that figure that right now everybody's really coming down hard on, Andrew Jackson, President Jackson. I mean, after all, didn't he just get rid of the Indians and move them because he wanted to make money from the sale of the land that the Indians were in? I mean, it's always been like this. Didn't Washington actually, say, well, the capital should be here on this particular site where D.C. is right now because he happened to own the land and he sold it to the Congress? It's always been thus. It's just that lately it just seems to be everywhere. I mean, and they're much more brazen about it. At least Carnegie had the idea, well, I'm going to fund all these things and I'm not going to make any money out of it, but at least, it's for the greater good. Of course, never mind that, he brought in Pinkerton to, shoot down the strikers, and that he was paying a pittance for his workers. Oh, but I'm going to make all these things and my name will live on. So I guess that is a kind of rational choice too, as well, because he wanted to make sure his name lived on as a great benefactor. But the way that it's done, nowadays it seems that, all think tanks and all these great things, they're very intimately connected to the corporate world.
And they tend to promote policies that benefit the corporate world, and often that's war, unfortunately, right?
Yes. Unfortunately, yes, but not necessarily, and not anymore, I think. I think, fortunately, that has changed. I think the corporate world right now, if you ask for my opinion, and we're veering away from Rand here, but I think the corporate world has realized that there is much more profit to be made by turning everybody into a consumer.
Which has its own problems.
Right, exactly. Instead of having the government as its main client, let's make the whole world our customer. Let's make the whole world, become consumers. But obviously what you're seeing all over the world, consumerism has taken over the entire world, except, believe it or not, in those places where you have religious beliefs, such as the Middle East. So those places where people are willing to actually die for a cause. As a matter of fact, I think they're about the only people left in the whole world that actually are I want to say irrational, but non-rational. Mm-hmm. People like ISIS in the Middle East. People who are, even Al-Qaeda. I mean, why are they doing these things? It's not rational for them. It's not rational for somebody to be a suicide bomber. But we have them, don't we? Mm-hmm. The name might not even be known by anyone. I mean, so unless you go, you fall for the thing, oh, yeah, they're going to get the reward in heaven. Nah, maybe. But what I'm trying to point out is that the only countries where consumerism has not taken hold is in those countries that are right now driven by religious conflict.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to be the whole policy of, at least of the Atlanticist powers, Anglo-American sphere, is to sort of impose a corporate monoculture on the world, through these various globalist trade deals and things like that.
That is correct. Yeah. That is correct. I totally agree with you, and that's why I think that the opposition to NAFTA, I think, is well taken. Mm-hmm. And I don't really think that the ordinary Americans have really benefited that much from NAFTA. I mean, I think the elites have benefited from it. I think corporations have benefited from it. But when you don't have a countervailing influence, and let's be clear here. What we had in the 1950s, and you want to be rational about this, is that, you had the government and you had the corporate world, and you had the third leg of that stool, which is unions. And what you had is that the corporate world, regardless of whether unions became corrupt or not, because after all, government is corrupt, and we know as well that the corporate world as well is corrupt. So corruption is everywhere. But there was an attempt, and a very successful attempt, on a matter of fact, on the part of the corporate world to destroy the power of unions, because unions were what stood between this corporate hegemony that we have right now. And matter of fact, that's one of the things that Ronald Reagan did. As soon as he came in, he destroyed the air traffic controllers. Not only that, that's what a lot of observers have said, that is what has really kept down wages. Because and going back again to NAFTA, I agree that there should be more innovation. There should be more that we should be open to greater trade, but at what cost? The cost, it has been the American worker who has really taken it, who has had to put up with all these things. The people who may not, even office workers. Let me give you an example. My daughter, who is 24, right now, if she were to go to work as in a store, in a department store, let's say Michael Kors, a fancy one, Coach, or anything like that, she was making the same that I was making more than 30 years ago. Which, this is unacceptable. And these people make billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars. Ralph Lauren, for instance, but yet their sales associates, that's what they make. Mm-hmm. How could that be? Who has benefited from all these changes? Like you mentioned before, it has been corporate America. But then we strain away from brand, and I'm not on a soapbox, and I'm not running for office. But I understand the frustration of all these people, and like I said, I think that the Rand study is quite right on the money when it says that a lot of the people who are voting for Mr. Trump are voting out of self-interest, and they're being very rational in their approach. And I see it.
It's difficult to sort. It's difficult to sort these things out, but a lot of it, the moving of factories to the third world, that's been facilitated by decades of destabilization by the first world, creating cheap labor. When you disrupt agriculture, so you can exploit the resources and create a huge urban underclass.
Right. And I guess if you go back then to Rand once again, it goes back to rational choice theory. Why? Because let me tell you one thing that perhaps people nowadays do not remember, or perhaps they didn't even know. Until this wave of deregulation, I'm fine because it pains me to see all this, to have lived through all this, because I saw it myself. You know, before this wave of deregulation, which starts with Carter but really takes hold during Reagan and on, corporations did not see themselves as just beholden to the shareholders. They thought that corporations had three duties. Corporations had a duty to shareholders, of course, you have to make money, but they also had a duty to their country, the place where they happened to do business in. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, they also had a duty to their employees because they had a civil responsibility because they viewed themselves as, and here's the word again, citizens, not as consumers. Citizens. Citizens have rights and they have duties.
Or human resources, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And you know, they have rights and duties. So they have rights as a corporation to make money, and you know, but they also have the duty to do right by their country that they live in, that hosts them, and to do right also by their employees, without whom they could not make that profit. Starting with rational choice theory, starting again with the theories of the Chicago School as well, which again is rational choice. That's the economics theory coming out of the Chicago School, the University of Chicago. And it says, no. Corporations have no duty or obligation to anybody except to the shareholders. And I'm telling you, that's not the way it was for hundreds of years, not only here, but throughout the world. And it's only because of the development of rational choice theory that this obsession with being singly devoted to shareholders that we find ourselves in the position that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the idea of the corporation itself, the idea of corporate personhood, came out of the Santa Clara decision, which created corporate personhood. And it, prior to that, the idea of a corporation was usually it was a limited charter. It had to have a stated purpose and it had to have benefit the community. But the whole idea of corporate personhood is a legal fiction created, which arguably in itself is a distortion of the genuine free market. You know.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. You're going to make a libertarian out of me yet.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to. Yeah, I had my libertarian phase, and it's an important phase to go through because it does. There's some great. It provides some great explanatory power, especially in terms of economics.
Yes, it does.
But then,
it does.
So yeah, you have to understand these. But then again, when you really want to, put it under the laser, under the microscope rather, and you can see where everywhere you go, there's malfeasance, corruption, and someone's whether it's
it's human nature.
Yeah, I mean,
as the scorpion said when it bit the frog as it was trying to go across the creek, I can't help it. It's in my nature.
But it's funny you mentioned Chicago, because Chicago University was started by Rockefeller. And
yes.
And out of there,
and that's what Albert Wolsteller wound up too.
And that's also where the neoconservatives came out, which is kind of fun. I wanted to touch on this before I let you go tonight. A lot of these guys at RAND were neoconservatives. Of course, the neoconservatives were Trotskyites.
Yes, I was about to say that. And yet they started out as commies, and they wound up as right wingers. Which, by the way, happened to me as well to my dad. My dad was also, my dad was a member of the Communist Party when he was young, and by the time he died, I mean, my God, he was to the right, like 10 degrees to the right of Ronald Reagan. That's just the way it goes.
But it's almost like they never stopped being revolutionaries, though.
That's true. You're correct about that. That's funny. Yes. Good point.
There's one thing, like Theodore Adorno, because you mentioned that I was reading the book, and apparently there's some connection with Rand and the New School for Social Research, so-called Frankfurt School, and they played a very you could say they kind of turned subversion into a science, idea of cultural Marxism, the long march to the institutions and all that. And so there's something, there's an element there which, Theodore Adorno wrote the book, The Authoritarian Personality, where he argued that traditional families were fascist, and the way you prevent America's slide to fascism was destroy the traditional family. It's a
Yes,
very
I know. It's insane.
yeah yeah
It's insane.
yeah
That's
very
the only way I can describe that. Literally, it's like what
it.
are you thinking?
I think what it's a reaction. It probably was a reaction to National Socialism in Germany. But the idea
Could
is
be.
when it's also an ethnic thing. A lot of these people, these guys are Jewish, and they emerged from
Yeah.
the Russia, the Pale settlement, and they come to the United
Right.
States where they're given a very good life, and they no longer really have to be revolutionaries, but they can't. It's almost like it's in their DNA. They can't stop it. It's not alcove A, alcove B in New York. They got to be revolutionaries, and that's how they think.
Okay.
They're,
I guess. But a lot of people were revolutionaries, especially because of the depression. I mean that really turned
yeah.
a lot of people into revolutionaries, and I thank God for FDR. I mean, if it had been for FDR, we would have had a revolution in this country.
You're talking
But,
talking to a libertarian here.
Okay, sorry,
No.
don't mean to offend you.
No, I know FDR. But my grandfather was a Taft man in the 40s, Ohio Republican. but
okay, all right.
one other thing is just before that, the whole idea of the think tanks, because I touched on it earlier, was we mentioned Brookings, but at the same time you had the development of the Council of Foreign Relations in 1921,
Yes.
and this, of course,
Yes.
Dulles Brothers. This largely represents Wall Street, Rockefeller, the bankers. In England, you have the development of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is almost created in conjunction with the Council on Foreign Relations, that Anglo-American elite.
Right, exactly.
Posing as a think tank, but advocating policies, posing as an independent, apolitical think tank, but really creating, becoming a parallel or shadow government that can control.
Yes, exactly.
Rand itself, did Rand ever get itself involved in things, some of the more seedy aspects of, social engineering? Like, I know we mentioned it's the 50s and 60s. That's MK Ultra. That's when the CIA got involved in a lot of these think tanks and universities, and even you could argue the entire psychiatric profession was co-opted by the CIA. Did they ever get involved in anything like that?
Actually, no, because they thought the CIA was too stupid.
Okay.
They always look down on the CIA and say, "Oh, these guys don't know what they're doing." But I mean, obviously, there was cooperation. There was covert cooperation, especially in Vietnam. But ultimately, no, I don't think there was. They were really too involved especially in any covert operations or in any. How should I say anything? Dirty dealing, for lack of a better word.
Not in Phoenix, Operation Phoenix, or anything like that.
Well, now that's something else. That's something else. Now that was instituted by somebody who was affiliated with Rand, but Rand itself was not directly involved in that. But it, again, is a consequence of their approach. And by the way, and I hate to say this because it sounds awful, but Operation Phoenix was successful. They did eradicate the VC. If you look at their stats, they did. They were. That's why, in a way, Hanoi all of a sudden had to come in with their troops because they knew that their infrastructure in the south was being lost. But that's neither here nor there. I mean,
basically from
I don't want to condone wholesale, slaughter like that.
Yeah, but from a coldly rational Rand standpoint, it was a success.
An enormous success, yes. Unqualified success, yes.
Now, one other thing is also we mentioned Rand and doing studies in urban studies and reforming government and maybe involving itself in calculating or influencing public opinion. You can construe that as being a form of psychological warfare, I guess, advertising. I mean, but some of the colored revolutions we see going on today, some of the strategies of social media, the use of flash mobs. I was reading a book by William Engdahl, and he claimed that some of the strategies developed at RAND were employed against other governments by the CIA. Now it's being used by NGOs, which are cover for CIA. But he said that, like, a good example was in France, 1968, de Gaulle was putting a lot of pressure on the United States, trying them to redeem dollars for gold under the terms of the Bretton Woods, and the United States did not want to do that. So lo and behold, there's a student revolt in France, and the swarming. He says that what happened was CIA was active in France, undermining the de Gaulle regime using swarming techniques developed by Rand. Did you come across anything like that? Or
No, I did not.
Okay.
I did not. I have not. But I would not be surprised that they, some of those techniques, yes, would be used. That they did do those studies. But if you're asking me whether I have corroboration of Rand's collaboration with the CIA in that, I don't know. But, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because I think the CIA is a very opportunistic organization. And you already had a lot of unrest in France at the time, because the same thing also happened in Italy. It happened in other countries. We had the same problem here, and you can't really say that, it was all because of the CIA. But like I said, they are opportunistic, and they use that to the best, possible use.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, and also we've done. There's been some more updated research regarding some of the upheaval here in the United States. A lot of that, whether it's the drug culture was supported by MK Ultra, which is CIA. Promoting drugs, some of the connections between some of the rock music scenes of the 60s and some of the cultural programming that occurred here in the country was conducted through some of these think tanks and through the CIA. So there's some evidence to that. But again, it's probably conjecture at this point. At
this point, yes.
Yeah. I don't.
It's not like the 1980s when there's pretty convincing evidence that they were involved, with the Contras and smuggling drugs here and in exchange for weapons and all that. That's pretty much. Let me put it this way: I'm a believer. I'm a believer. But when you have big social movements like this, what they do is they just ride the wave and see how can they maneuver it so they can get something. How can they maneuver it to their advantage? That's the way that I see it.
Like LSD was introduced by the CIA, and then there's a lot of the rock festivals. George Hunter White, working with the CIA, he was a narcotics agent, really was a CIA agent, conducting these tests out in New York and L.A. or San Francisco, and branching out, and they started doing mass doses, at rock festivals, seeing what the reaction would be. But I mean, are you telling me that Timothy Leary was a CIA agent? Come on, let's not go overboard on this, okay? So, well, listen, Alex, thanks for coming on the show. Anything else you want to say about Rand, or anything we need to cover, or?
Well, I just think they're still around. And like I said, I do believe that if Hillary Clinton becomes president, that Rand will have a replay of the same influence that it had during the 1980s under Donald Rumsfeld, because she is a hawk. She will use, she will intervene militarily. She will put boots on the ground. And a lot of those operations then will be guided to a very large degree by plans that will have been developed in Rand. You have worked in Rand as well.
Something to look forward to.
Between a rock and a hard place, my friend.
That is Alex Abella. His book is Soldiers of Reason, The Rand Corporation and the Rise of the American Empire. Is there anything new you're working on that we want to tell people about, or?
Actually, right now, what I'm working on, I've gone back to fiction. So I've written a couple of historical novels, but if Hillary comes in, I might have to do I have to revise the work on Rand and see what they're doing next.
Well, listen, Alex, it's a great book. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the past, 60 years of American history, of world history, and where we are today. It's if you understand what the Cold War was and the arms race and the whole philosophy, the milieu of the time, you capture it in this book, and it's a wonderful work. Thank you, and I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight. And,
my pleasure.
And I'll wish you a good night.
All right, good night.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.